Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Before we get into the meat and sinew of all of this, I should just let you know we don't know exactly when this is going to air. I'm recording this on Tuesday morning, around 8:30, morning after the ceasefire. We don't know if it's going to hold. Don't know if it is holding. Any of that kind of stuff on Iran. We're going to try and stay away from news that will get really stale really quickly. And this is much more in the tradition of our long-running, soon-to-be long-running counter-programming trend around here. So just bear that in mind, and on with the show. So today's guest, fan favorite, my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, even though now he is a suit, as the head of the domestic policy something or other. I don't know. They drink a lot of champagne over there. And he's also a columnist for the Free Press. And he is a regular on the Commentary podcast, where he gets probably the most airtime after John Podhoretz, almost in double-digit percentages of talking time on that podcast, which is very impressive. None other than Matt Continetti. Matt, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thanks, Jonah. It's great to be here.
You've already talked more to me than you talk to John on some mornings. I'm being unkind because I love. All right, so why don't we just sort of start at the beginning? We've been waiting a long time. I think it's fair to say we are among the remnant, as it were, who have been checking our watches, tearing the days off the calendar, waiting for the Sam Tannenhouse biography of William F. Buckley to finally come out. You were probably in, high school when he signed on to do this? I mean...
That's right. I think he got the assignment, so to speak, from Bill Buckley in 1997 to write the authorized biography, and that's the year that I got my driver's license.
There you go. Okay. So, and it is about 18 months before I started, or a year before I started at National Review. And I was at National Review for 20 years. So we've been waiting a while.
And, for a while, I thought Tannenhouse would turn out to be like a George R.R. Martin and never actually complete his long in the making project. But he finished it, and it was published, and not only did it land, it kind of collided. I mean, the book is so thick that if you dropped it from a B-2 bomber, say, it would leave quite an impact crater.
I see what you did there.
Thank you.
All right, so as a Free Press columnist, I'm told I should be mentioning that more often. Word on the street. You wrote a lengthy review of it. What'd you think of it?
Well, I have to say I was a little disappointed in the book. It's a book that's both too long and too short. The book is close to 1,000 pages long, but you get the sense, especially as you get closer to the present, that Tannenhouse is rushing. And when you get to 1975, which was a good 34 years before Buckley died in 2008, the book comes to a sudden halt. And the last third of Buckley's life is condensed into 100 pages. And that was the part of the book that I was actually looking forward to the most, because I am a great fan of John Judas's biography of William F. Buckley Jr., which came out in 1988-89. And that book also basically ends with Reagan's election, but for good reason, because not much had happened.
Right.
There is another good biography. There have been at least 6 biographies of William F. Buckley Jr. written since he first appeared on the scene in the 1950s. My friend Al Felsenberg, the historian, wrote a very good one called A Man and His Presidents, which came out about a decade ago. That actually took the story from Buckley's birth until his death and talked about what Buckley thought about each of the presidents during his lifetime. So for anyone interested in how Buckley related to his friend Ronald Reagan when Reagan became president, or what Buckley thought about President Clinton, President Bush, and then candidate Obama, who was in his ascent when Buckley died.
I mean, Nixon's the most interesting one, but we can get that.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that too.
Yeah.
We can look at Al's book.
Yeah, it seems to me like I have full disclosure. I have not read the whole thing. I dip in and out through my Kindle version of it. I had been asked by various people if I wanted to review it a year ago, and I just begged off because just the bandwidth required. Like, there's an unwritten rule in our world, which I try not to like pay attention to, but it does kick in sometimes. If you're going to write a negative review, you really do have to read the whole book. if it's a positive review, it's less so, and that's one of the reasons I don't like doing book reviews. Is just the amount of effort that goes into something like that.
Well, and I will say that one of the best pieces of advice I ever received came from a certain journalist named Jonah Goldberg, who told me, and then I heard you say in different contexts to young journalists, that when you start out, the best thing to do is write book reviews.
Yeah.
Because everyone is looking as a young writer for his or her value add. What do you bring that no one else has? And that can be hard when you're 22 because you don't have sources to report breaking news. You don't have expertise because you're just a college age. But we would hope that if you're going to be a journalist, you can read. And so you can read a book, and maybe you can even read other books that deal with the same topic, and you can produce a good review. So you're right. Reading is essential to writing a book review. And I read the whole book. I can confess. Of course, this is my life. This is my specialty. I live and breathe 20th century American conservatism. I would say there are a few things I learned in the book that I didn't know beforehand. I did not know about the Buckley family newspaper in South Carolina, which had connections to certain citizens' councils, but which were the pro-segregation groups there in the South in the 1950s. But the connection to Buckley himself was extremely tenuous.
Yeah.
And I also didn't quite appreciate Buckley's schooling, and especially his time at Millbrook, his prep school, which was near actually the family home in Sharon, Connecticut, and how Buckley really formed as a debater and a intellectual performer during that time. Also, the extent to which he was a supporter of Charles Lindbergh and America First, opposing American entry into World War II. I knew that, of course, but Tannenhouse,
I mean, that's in the Nash book. It's been written about.
Tannenhouse brings it out, I think, very well, and that was helpful for me. It was clarifying. At the same time, there was so much that I wanted that just wasn't there. What I think was interesting is Tannenhouse, subtitled the book "The Man and the Revolution That Changed America," and there's no question Bill Buckley changed America. The question is, what revolution is Tannenhouse referring to? And I think Charles Kessler of the Claremont Review of Books made this point very well. He said the actual revolution that occupies a lot of Tannenhouse's attention is not the conservative revolution, but it's the Middle American Revolution. It's the shift of the white working class away from the Democratic Party beginning in the 1960s toward a conservative inflected populism that, of course, continues to this day and has, in fact, expanded to include the working class, Hispanic voters, black male voters, and others. So what I found is that conservatism, American conservatism, Buckleyism, is actually neglected in certain parts of the book. So you don't really learn a lot about, say, James Burnham, who was the chief intellectual influence on National Review. You don't learn about Frank Meyer, who was so important to conservatism. And then when we get closer in time, you have very just glancing attempts to explain what was happening inside the conservative movement in Buckley's final years, against this backdrop of kind of just a typical liberal view. Reagan was a plutocrat who was insensitive to victims of the AIDS epidemic, and George W. Bush was a evangelical warmonger. And in between, you get Buckley had a very complicated position on the Iraq War, which we can talk about if you'd like. And then a few passing glances at the succession from Buckley to John O'Sullivan to then Rich Lowry at National Review, which, of course, as a journalist and as somebody who knows everybody in this world, I was hoping I could get some good gossip, but there really wasn't anything in there. So the book left me disappointed.
Yeah, so like that. I mean, that's what I was trying to get at. Is that is my impression from one of the great things about having the ebook is you can search, you use a heuristic and say, okay, so what does he say about Frank Meyer?
Yeah,
and it's like, okay, that's not very interesting. What does he say about Wilmore Kendall? More interesting, but really short shrift.
Very short. Yeah.
And of course, what does he say about me? Nothing.
This is a great Buckley story, by the way. Of course, when Buckley handed his friend Norman Mailer a copy of his latest book, I forget which one, Mailer opened up the book. He turned to the index, looked in his name, and Buckley had scrawled in the margin, "Hi, Norman." knowing that the first thing that Norman Mailer, the pugilistic journalist in the mid 20th century, would do would be to look up his own
for
name.
Sure, yeah. And it occurred to me while going through it and then reading your review and Kessler's and a bunch of the others is he should have done this Robert Caro style and picked discrete time chunks.
Yeah,
come out with the book. William F. Buckley, the 1950, from God and Man at Yale, or from birth to God and Man at Yale, slim 250-page book, whatever, and then move on or something like that.
Well, this reminds me of the great David Brooks parody of Buckley's Overdrive that appeared in the Chicago Maroon in 1980, 81 or 82, which is that, by the time Buckley graduated from Yale in 1950, he had produced 3 autobiographies. The first dealt with the moment of his conception up until his birth. The second dealt with his schooling, and then the third dealt with his time at Yale. So it's you could stretch it out in all these time capsules if you'd like. As an aside, James Rosen, the conservative journalist, has produced the first volume of a very good Scalia biography of Justice Scalia, called Rise to Greatness, came out a couple of years ago. And that only covers the first 50 years of Justice Scalia's life. And in fact, the first volume ends with his appointment to the Supreme Court. So we're all waiting the second volume, because then you get into all the great dissents and Supreme Court politics. I had the sense, reading this biography, that Tannenhouse probably did plan to write a 2-volume book, but for whatever reason, that just didn't happen. And so, again, you're kind of left with the sense of, well, what's on the cutting room floor? There's another great story. The great philosopher and kind of neocon fellow traveler Sidney Hook produced a marvelous autobiography that I recommend to all young people called Out of Step. And Out of Step is about 900 pages long, 800 pages as published. But it turns out that it was twice the length when Sidney, who, he was very active in the anti-communist movement, but at the end of the day, he was a philosophy professor, and it's all about his intellectual fights over the years. So it was, some 1,600 pages long when he submitted it to his publisher, and they told him to cut it in half. So intrepid researchers can actually go to the Hoover archive at Stanford, and they can find the unexpurgated Sidney Hook autobiography. I'm hoping that one day we'll be able to go to the Buckley papers, or if the Tannenhouse papers, and we'll be able to find the actual full draft of the Buckley book.
All right, so I've allowed us to go off on tangents and wallow a bit here.
Wallow.
So something that is Tannenhouse makes a big deal about, and so did John Judas in his biography, which I go back and forth what I think about that biography. I found it very useful when I first read it. The William F. Buckley, Patron Saint of the Conservatives, by John Judas, who's a man of the left, but also a very sharp guy, right? But both of them make a big deal out of Buckley's supposed inability to write his big book on conservatism,
Right.
and Tannenhouse takes it to the point where he basically says Buckley wasn't an intellectual, never mind a theorist. And I'm okay saying Buckley wasn't necessarily a theorist, whatever you might mean by that. But I find the idea of saying he wasn't an intellectual one of the more ridiculous claims possible about Buckley. I mean, again, we can get bogged down in definitions, but you ask a normal person, a normal college-educated person, a normal intellectual, what is an intellectual? Certainly, what is a public intellectual, which used to have a real meaning in this stuff. Buckley runs through the tape on the definition of that in so many different ways. It's very hard for me to understand. So here's my theory, and I just want to see what you think of it. Mm-hmm. I think part of the reason why Tannenhouse, who I like personally, I've met him a few times. I loved the Whittaker Chambers biography. I think at the end of the day, the big problem for Tannenhouse is he doesn't actually really understand conservatism, and really struggles to understand conservatism on its own terms. And so, like, he famously, in that Death of Conservatism book he wrote in 2009, he was going around saying that the point of William F. Buckley was he was there to make liberalism better.
Right.
And
which is not the thesis of this book, by the way.
Is not. Yeah. I didn't
which
get
is
that
interesting. Yeah.
And I suspect he regrets writing that earlier book. And I have my own theories about why Bill couldn't get the conservatism book done, but I also just don't think it's nearly as important a thing,
right,
as Tannenhouse and Judas do. So, what do you think of that? His argument about the conservatism book and my claim about Tannenhouse kind of struggles with understanding conservatives on their own terms.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great theory, and I'll try to unpack it a little bit. So, just for context, Bill Buckley makes a big splash on the intellectual scene in 1951 when he publishes God and Man at Yale, his attack on his alma mater for neglecting its animating purposes of educating young men in Christianity and in American principles, including the free market. Very similar to many critiques of the universities today, so many years later. So Buckley is instantly an intellectual celebrity at age 26, and he's already becoming a big deal on the college speaking circuit, which is where he drew so much of his fame over the years. Then he gets very involved with McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, and McCarthyism, uprooting communists, real and imagined, in the executive branch of government. That's his second book, co-written with his brother-in-law, Brent Bozell Jr., on defending McCarthy. It comes out in 1954, really right before McCarthy's precipitous fall. And then the very next year, in 1955, Buckley launches National Review, the first, I'd say, conservative journal of intellectual opinion and cultural critique aimed at a larger audience than the previous journals. There had been the American Mercury, L.H.L. Mencken's magazine. There had been the Freeman, which was Albert J. Knox magazine, a very important figure to Buckley. But National Review's purpose was, I think, to reach out beyond the little sects of conservatism and, as they say in the opening statement, really launch a counter-revolution against liberalism, which had dominated the country since FDR. So National Review has a few rocky years at the beginning, but Buckley is thriving, and he's leading this movement. Late 1950s, very interesting period, of course, because conservatism is very marginal in the United States. And so much of the early National Review is devoted to attacking a popular Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, and his vice president, Richard Nixon. So the question is, well, what's Buckley going to do next? He was under a lot of pressure, including from his father, who was extremely important in understanding both Buckley and American conservatism, to either get an academic degree, get a law degree, just write something big, important, meaningful. And so that's when he starts on this book called The Revolt Against the Masses. And it was going to be his take on kind of Albert J. Nock's idea of the remnant, the few who understand Western civilization and keep its ideas and principles alive amidst mass society, amidst totalitarianism. And it just didn't gel. And so, like you say, his liberal biographers, Judas and Tannenhouse, kind of take this to mean that just Buckley didn't have it in him. Maybe he wasn't a political theorist, or in Tannenhouse's case, he was more a theatrical personality than he was an intellectual. I don't really buy that. I'm a writer. A lot of my ideas don't work. There are times where I just have to stop. I've also written plenty of book proposals that went nowhere. So here's Buckley trying an idea, just didn't really work. It was a little bit abstract, conceptual. And the truth is, that's not what makes Buckley's writing fun. So when Buckley really explodes in popularity is between 1962, when he gets his nationally syndicated column, which is when he's commenting 3 times a week on current events, in 1966, when he gets Firing Line, his television show, which runs for 33 years. In between then, of course, is his mayoral run in New York City, where New York is the media capital of America and the world, and he's on television almost every night, displaying his wit, his kind of erudition, his whole style and manner, and people love it, especially the working class voters in the outer boroughs. Very importantly, out of that experience comes Buckley's book, The Unmaking of a Mayor, which is the story of his campaign, also his platform. Right?
Probably his best book. What do you think?
I love it.
Yeah.
It's my favorite. I'll get to my favorite in a second. But it's among my top 5, and the reason is, with Unmaking of a Mayor, Buckley really discovers the style that's best suited for him, which is essentially autobiographical. I'm going to take you through what my crazy, interesting life, and I'm going to use my life and experiences as a way to illustrate my ideas and my sensibility. And that's the model that he applies to my favorite book of his called Cruising Speed, which is literally an account of 1 week in his life. It's the same style he brings to United Nations Journal, which is a very excellent book about his time as a representative to the United Nations under the Nixon administration. And it's also the model he brings to his sailing books like Airborne, which is probably my favorite of those. And so I don't think it's a bad thing that he didn't write this book, which, quite frankly, I find the idea kind of boring, of the revolt against the masses. I'm much happier that he tried and that didn't work out, like so many ideas don't work out. And then eventually he discovered his true form, which is essentially writing about himself. And the fact was, he was so interesting, everybody wanted to read him. So second, on the idea of Judas and Tannenhouse not truly understanding conservatism, I do think there's something to that. I think Tannenhouse understands anti-communism. And that is why the Whittaker Chambers book is quite good. And even in the passages in the first half, you have to say, of this biography of Buckley that deal with anti-communism, I think there is a certain sympathy there. Not entirely for Buckley and McCarthy, but at least an understanding of their motives and a recognition on Tannenhouse's part that liberalism did have a problem with communism. It did have fellow travelers in its ranks. It did take a very apologistic attitude toward the communist enterprise. But anti-communism is not the same as conservatism. course, anti-communism is the glue that held the conservative movement in America together for so many decades. But you can be an anti-communist and not be a conservative.
Right.
To be an American conservative, you
Look
have
at Sidney Hook.
Exactly. We just talked about Sidney Hook, right?
Yeah.
And so many of those early neocons, of course, started off as anti-communist liberals. To be a conservative,
and the earlier ones started off as communists.
And exactly. James Burnham, Frank Meyer, right? So you have to be a conservative. You do have to have a certain appreciation, I think, of the market, and you have to believe that yes, the free market as a theory better describes reality than alternative views, right? And you also have to have the conservative appreciation for a transcendental moral order, the idea that values are objective, there is right and wrong, there is good and evil, and that at the end of the day, human beings are imperfect creatures. And so those values or ideas are, to me, what defines a conservative, and an American conservative in particular is seeking to defend the American political inheritance, which means the Declaration and the Constitution. If you don't have that same gestalt, this is the remnant, so I can use that word, you're not going to be able to really get into the weeds in your subject, really understand what American conservatism is about. And if you have the attitude, as so many liberals do, that at the end of the day, it's social conditions that matter much more than individual acts or individual character, you're just going to have a field problem. You're not going to be able to appreciate the phenomenon for what it is.
Yeah, so I think I agree with all of that. I mean, I certainly agree with the second half. On the Buckley and the book thing, first of all, I would have loved to have read his Revolt Against the Masses. I would have been really into seeing where he comes down on the synthesis. But I think I want to apologize to listeners. I attributed it to the wrong book when I was talking to Eli Lake recently, but it originally came out in Have You Ever Seen a Dream Walking? Where Buckley tries to offer a definition of conservatism.
Right.
And you can tell he really doesn't want to get it dragged into it, because the title of the essay is something like Notes Towards a Working Definition of Empirical Definition of Conservatism, Reluctantly and Apologetically Given. Right? When you put that in the title, he's like,
it's a warning sign. Yeah,
he's basically screaming, "Don't hold me to this!" Right? And I think that part of it, he had that line that I guess he first got from Chambers, which he often repeated and endorsed, which was that conservatism needs to be more about not holding on to the last redoubt, but maneuvering, right? That to live is to maneuver, To live is to maneuver, right? And I think that part of the problem, because I'm grappling with this a lot these days myself, because I ponder, dear God, writing a book about conservatism, is there's almost a fundamental irreconcilability inside of American conservatism, because American conservatism, not wholly, not completely, but a big chunk of it is conserving a radical revolution, right? The revolutionary tradition, despite Hannah Arendt and a lot of people being very, 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 very wrong about this, does not begin in France. It begins in the United States. And this was something that was well known and well established until the 1850s. And no one disputed that the revolutions in Europe drew their first inspiration from the revolution in the United States. And that tradition of of conserving the founders' principles, which were revolutionary principles, does not rest perfectly within the other conservative commitments that conservatives have. And I don't see this as a fatal flaw by any stretch. I think it's one of its strengths, is this comfort with contradiction, at a sort of almost a metaphysical level. Frank Meyer understood this, which is why he always talked about tensions, right? That's the tension. Fusionism was always about a tension
And balance,
of
yeah.
liberty and order, freedom and virtue, right? These things, and the way the Burkean sort of approach solves this is, not to sound too much like Yuval here, our friend and colleague, is that virtually all philosophical principles hit a point of diminishing returns, right? Is that you're supposed to say that, yes, we value that, but to a point. And because sometimes if you value freedom too much, you lose your commitment to order. If you value order too much, you lose your commitment to freedom. And it's that enduring tension that keeps conservatism intellectually vibrant, because we're constantly arguing about where the trade-offs are in our dogma. And I think Buckley kind of understood that and didn't want, and I think it's one of the reasons why he encouraged Meyer so much with the fusionism stuff, is because he sort of felt it in his bones that was right. But putting that down on paper gets really complicated.
Right. Yeah.
And meanwhile, if you could write about getting drunk with David Niven and Stad, and that book is going to sell 10 times as well, why not do that instead? So that's sort of my big picture.
Especially, and the only thing I add, especially when you have giants amongst you, like Friedrich Hayek and the Constitution of Liberty, like Leo Strauss and Natural Right and History, like Eric Voegelin and the New Science of Politics. When you have these big philosophical titans going at it, right? Well, maybe you find your value add. And your value add is talking about those ideas, creating a journal where those ideas are published and debated, publicizing those ideas through your various media channels, and then kind of adding your sensibility to the ideas, which ultimately makes the ideas attractive and fun. Big part of Buckley's appeal, I think, throughout the decades. And the reason that this event that we'll be holding on June 25th at AEI to talk about Buckley's centenary, and you will be there and I'll be there and Yuval Levin and Ramesh Ponnuru will be there, is sold out. We have a capacity crowd, is because Buckley made conservatism fun.
Right.
You wanted to be part of something. He was smart. He was so quick on his feet. He was funny. He had this amazing life. He knew everybody. Liberals treated him as an equal sparring partner. That sort of personality, I think, does more for conservatism than another book about the tension between freedom and virtue.
Yeah, no, I agree with that entirely. But on the charge that he's not an intellectual, I mean, again, I'm sure Tannenhouse, maybe somewhere in the book, has some definition of intellectual that I've missed in my hunting and pecking. But you were the editor of a publication, like you run a department at AEI. The idea that you could edit or solicit pieces or give editorial feedback to James Burnham, Wilmore Kendall, right? All of these people, and edit their pieces and edit their journal and argue with them about where they come down on things and convene all the, without being an intellectual. I mean, again, definitions matter. It's just so
it's so odd. And usually the knock on Buckley was that he was a public intellectual, meaning he appeared on TV. That's the real distinction between a public intellectual and an intellectual. Both, I think, fit Daniel Bell's definition of an intellectual as someone who lives by and for ideas. And there's no question Buckley lived by and for ideas. His ideas were conservative, and he wanted those ideas to triumph in the world. But he was also a celebrity. He was an intellectual celebrity. And there is this group of intellectuals who believe that once you become a mainstream figure, once you're no longer writing articles for little magazines and such, in between drags on your cigarette, you're no longer an intellectual. But for someone to me who would fit this kind of definition of an intellectual, Irving Kristol, who rarely appeared on television, and did edit a little magazine, and whose biggest exposure to his writing was his monthly column in the Wall Street Journal. He thought William F. Buckley was an intellectual.
For sure.
There was no question.
Yeah. I mean, Irving used to have a rule that if the public interest had more than 7,000 subscribers, it was doing something wrong.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which I love. Although as the co-founder of a media outlet, we cannot indulge that thinking. All right, so I have we can close out the 10 and House book insofar as I don't want to be utterly disparaging, particularly because I haven't read the whole thing. There are moments where I find it very engaging as I hunt around in it.
He's a very good writer.
He's a very good writer. If you want to learn about the man, I think he seems to have pulled that off. If you want to learn about the ideas that motivated him, and if you want to learn about the institutions that mattered most to him, from my reading so far, it comes up short.
Well, I have a book you can read instead.
It's right.
It's called The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism by yours truly.
Which I heartily endorse, and people can go back and listen to the multiple episodes that we did based on that.
Before and after publication.
Yeah, although we never closed out the Reagan to the present stuff.
We just said we're like Tannenhouse.
That's right.
We just kind of came to a stop when Reagan was elected.
Or maybe what we can do is do it like Edmund Morris and just I'll create you as a dream character and I'll have conversations with you. Anyway, so as I said, I'm struggling with the idea of writing another book of any kind. Never mind one about conservatism. Yeah, and I don't want to leave it all. I don't want to leave it all in the locker room. Insofar as I have a thesis that I think is somewhat new, and I would start. Let me just put it. I'll tease you this day, and we can talk about it offline later. You start for totally defensible reasons in 1920 with your book. Nash, for totally defensible reasons, starts in 45, but in reality, then does these flashbacks to the 30s, which you have to do, right? Which again is another thing in the Tannenhouse thing that I think is sort of missing, is like the role of the New Deal in the formation of this thing that Buckley is born into.
Yeah,
right?
He focuses on FDR's foreign policy, not so much the New Deal bureaucracy.
And just the total tangent in parentheses, but you mentioned how he focuses so much on Buckley and America First. And if you want to disagree with me, that's fine, but I will fight you on this. The idea that America First and that form of isolationism in the 1930s, which everyone needs to remember, the Holocaust and the World War II hadn't happened yet. People didn't know what didn't happen yet. And so there's a tendency to play the movie backwards and think that like Lindbergh, who I'm not a huge fan of, was in favor of the Holocaust because he didn't want to get into World War II, but the Holocaust hadn't happened yet, right? So there's this weird way of we're looking at events backwards sometimes, that kind of stuff. But also the idea that America First was an explicitly right-wing and conservative thing in the 1930s is just false. There were isolationists across the ideological spectrum to the extent an ideological spectrum existed. It shouldn't be that shocking that the Buckleys were into it, but so were the Kennedys, right? And so were a lot of, J.T. Flynn, the head of the New York chapter of it, was a lefty in every regard, even though people keep calling him a right-winger.
This is also relevant today.
Yes, for sure.
We see it in today's debates over foreign policy.
But so anyway, people start the story of conservatism in different places, and they're all defensible on their own terms. And that's the thing. I would start earlier, and for American conservatism. And
you're going to start like Richard Weaver with William of Ockham, 1215.
Joachim of Fior.
That's Vogelin's. That's Vogelin's bad guy. Yeah.
Although Eric von Knut-Ledeen, which I believe is the correct way to pronounce it,
the world's smartest man.
He could do those tequila or Corona commercials about the world's most interesting guy, right? spoke like 13 languages, wore
Yes,
capes.
that's how he would advertise himself when he came at his lecture tours. You'd see these ads in National Review and say, "The world's smartest man, Eric von Kunnelt-Ledeen, is coming to a town near you."
He put a lot of emphasis on Jan Hus.
Oh yeah,
and so did Mussolini. So, but anyway,
interesting.
We're hearing a lot of talk these days. People are trying valiantly. I put in my own efforts from time to time of the perennial effort of the Sisyphusian effort of reclaiming the term classical liberal. I don't think we'll ever really get there, but it's, I try to use progressive now instead of liberal whenever possible. And sometimes it's tough, but I've always said, there's a passage about it in my first book, American conservatism is about more than classical liberalism, but a conservatism that doesn't conserve classical liberalism isn't worth conserving. Mm-hmm. And I still believe that. One of the things I'm trying to work through in my own head is what is American conservatism beyond the classical liberalism? Where does American conservatism run into conflict with philosophical classical liberalism, of Smith, of, that kind of thing? And I'm just kind of curious what your answer to that would be.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. I would say a lot depends on how we define classical liberalism or what we take as the limits of classical liberalism. So, as I alluded to earlier, I do think religion is extremely important to conservatism and the conservative mind. And the classical liberal attitude can be friendly toward religion. It can also be hostile to religion. So where it falls on religion is, I think, extremely important, especially in the United States, which has deeply religious roots, and of course, whose people have been religious for centuries. So that'd be one place. I do think classical liberalism, and you see this in Hayek, you see this to some degree in Milton Friedman, though Friedman, I think, was very prudential about what he said in his public statements regarding certain topics. And that is the idea of the nation and the idea of patriotism. And so a classical liberal argument does tend, if you read Hayek, toward I'm going to use the word globalist view, right? Mm-hmm. And I think conservatives and American conservatives would say, well, there have to be limits on that. There have to be boundaries on that because we are attached to a home, right? And then finally, there's with the classical liberal viewpoint, there's always this question of the family. So, of course, we as conservatives, as American conservatives, do take the individual as the primary political and economic unit. But I think sometimes classical liberals can forget that when we say individual, we mean adult individual.
Yeah.
And there's this great line early on in Friedman's seminal book, Capitalism and Freedom, from 1962, where he says, we're going to leave the ethical problems to the individual, and the household it's an interesting unit, but I'm not really going to talk about it, right? That's a paraphrase, but yeah. This idea that the family, the individual may be the primary unit of the polity and of the economy, but the family is the primary unit of society.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I think that's what conservatives say, and there are many classical liberals who may agree, but there are also some who say, oh, wait, the families can be constraining, right? Not every family is happy. Sometimes you have to leave a family, and sometimes parents are wrong. So that debate, I think, can exist between classical liberals and conservatives as well.
Yeah. So, but I think it's a good answer. I think part of the response to that is that Burkean response of yes, but to a point, right? Like you and I are very pro-family. If you weren't, you wouldn't be the head of domestic policy studies at AI. Like that would be really inconvenient for you if you were anti-family. But you and I have no doubt that you and I agree that there is a point at which you think the Leviathan state, the jackbooted representatives of government should take children away from parents, right? Like you do not have an absolute right to sexually abuse your kids, to physically abuse your kids, to starve your kid, right? Like, and so you can always start with the obvious and easy example, and then it's a question of how far back from that are you willing to go to give families autonomy, and reasonable people can disagree. I mean, what we don't want is like the Charlotte Perkins Gilman or that chick from MSNBC from 10 years ago talking about we have to move away from the idea of private ownership of
The
children.
Princeton professor who used to have an MSNBC show, right?
Yeah, I mean, like that's that's when people start saying we need to get away from the private ownership of children. That's when you flip the safety on your rifle, right? That's
Right.
just crazy talk. And so somewhere in there's an argument. I don't think, and I think Hayek. I mean, I have to look at what he actually says about family, but his whole microcosm versus macrocosm stuff, and his respect for tradition.
Absolutely.
No one's going to say Hayek wasn't a classical liberal. I don't think that puts him on the unconservative side of a lot of the issues that you're raising. And like Meyer would just agree with everything that you said, but also just say that, but it's attention, right?
Absolutely.
And so I still struggle with, I'm indebted to our friend and colleague Ramesh Ponnuru, who 25 years ago said to me, libertarianism is the greatest political philosophy ever created. It just has two weak points: foreign policy and children.
Right.
If it didn't have those, if neither of those were an issue, it's very difficult. If everybody was just a fully formed, reasonable adult, it's very difficult to argue with the thrust of libertarianism. But we don't live that way. We have children and we have foreign policy, but anyway, so I still struggle with this. Where are the major tectonic plates of classical liberalism and American conservatism rubbing against each other, and on a conceptual level? And you can see that. I think you're right about the patriotism stuff.
I don't think that it's so much that the tectonic plates are running up against American conservatism. What they're running up against is traditionalism. Mm-hmm. Right, which is the other wing of conservatism, the other branch. And we've talked a lot about Frank Meyer. We should mention there's a new biography of Frank Meyer coming out later this summer by the conservative author Daniel J. Flynn. It's published through ISI Books. It looks very good. I have the galley. I haven't had time to read it, but I'm very much looking forward to it. Frank Meyer, this extremely important figure, the literary editor of National Review for many years, but also a columnist for National Review, who really explored the unique qualities of American conservatism and how conservatism in America is a balancing between liberty and virtue, freedom and order. And this is described by one of his opponents on the more traditionalist side, his friend, Brent Bozell Jr., as fusionism. And so fusionism became the word to describe essentially Buckleyism, the position of National Review, and for many years the conservative movement. But what Meyer would say is that the tension is between the classical liberal ideals, which he was very sympathetic to in many ways, mostly, and then the traditionalist ideals. He thought they both worked together because of the unique nature of America, because America was founded 250 years ago next year, prior to the revolutions in Europe, that these two things, freedom and virtue, could work together in the United States, where in other contexts they could not. That's where the tectonic plates are rubbing up against each other, and to take the geographic or geological analogy, it's the fault line is in America, right? It's like how do you straddle this fault line? Where do you come down on which side? And I think conservatives would say that classical liberalism has a lot to go for it when it comes to how you're setting up a political system, how you are addressing the economy, right? But there are some questions that it leaves unanswered that have to deal in particular with kind of the family, the church, and then ultimately the nation state.
Yeah, I mean Strauss. I mean, and not just Strauss, but part of the. I think Strauss was a friend of. He said he was a friend of democracy. He was a friend of the democracy in the West and all of that kind of stuff. Even though people to this day keep doubting him about that. But one of the overlaps you can get from Hayek and Strauss and a bunch of others is that free societies, liberal societies, need somewhat illiberal institutions to form character, right? The family being the most important by far is an illiberal or non-liberal institution. It is prior to political theory. And what I mean by that is, something that's not a democracy, right? It's like it can't be a democracy because you can't give. At some point, you give children more and more agency in their lives, but in the beginning, you don't give them very much, and it's very controlled because you're trying to turn them from barbarians into citizens, and that's how character formation starts. But character formation works in a lot of other institutions that cannot be democratic. Doesn't mean they have to be. People think it's. I find this fascinating. If you tell people that certain institutions can't be democratic, they think you're against democracy. And I was like, well, do you think the Marines should be democratic? do you think, McDonald's should be democratic and the cashiers get a vote on what's on the menu? I mean, like, we understand this intuitively all over the place, but people, they have this reflexive response when you make these kinds of points. And so a free society needs non-free institutions to create the kind of character that appreciates a free society. And this plays into something we talk about a lot, which is the way primaries have ruined the Democratic and Republican Party, our political parties. And I think that that's the part of the tension that at an abstract level, at the level of sort of theory, classical liberalism struggles. I mean, again, Hayek is fine with everything I just said. In fact, I get a lot of it from Hayek. But
can I point out maybe one source of the tension is because, I think what you're saying is that at the end of the day, you have to have rules,
right?
So classical liberalism is for rules about how we govern the country, rules about economic intervention or the lack thereof. But in the non-liberal institutions you're describing, the rules are often not rational.
Right. Because humans aren't rational.
The classical liberals are rational. They have a theory. They perceive the world in a certain way, and based on that perception and judgment, they say this is how things should run. But families are instinctual,
right,
and old, right? And there's no real. It's hard to give the reasons for why a family works the way it does, and how kids are raised, hopefully in an upright manner. And when you turn to the church, well, that's based on revelation, right? Not reason. Divine revelation structures churches or religious faiths, and even the nation. The way that nations behave is not always rational. Far from it, right? Because it's, as Thucydides says, right, the cause of war is honor, interest, and fear. All of these things that are not necessarily rational. Interest may be the one.
Interest is the one, right?
But honor and fear, you can't. So I think that's how I would kind of draw the distinctions. The classical liberals, they're looking for these rules derived from reason. And a conservative says, look, there are things that we inherit, and we probably shouldn't investigate the reasons for them all too much because they've worked. And as you say, this is what Hayek points out in his defensive tradition, his excellent defense. They've worked over time. It's a learning process over time. But what liberals get up to no good, Jonah, is when they start kind of tinkering with the machinery and they say, well, this makes no sense. We should pull it out. And the next thing you know, the car breaks down.
Right. Yeah. No, it's the Chesterton's fence problem, right? And which is on the Remnant bingo card. All right, so I recently we're running out of time, but so I recently wrote this unforgivably long essay for the Dispatch about how there are big chunks of the American, let's call it the new right, and let's stipulate up front, just so we don't have to like constantly say, I'm not saying, caveating things. The new right is more diverse than certainly the way the mainstream media writes about it.
Yes.
And
it's neurodiverse. It's on the spectrum.
Yeah. And it's also and much more diverse than a lot of the new right claims it is, right? So that's part of the problem, is that a lot of people on the new right want to claim they're part of this mass unified movement, when in fact it's a whole bunch of different factions who hate each other, who are claiming or fighting for primacy, fighting for different priorities. Some of those priorities on the new right are anti-Semitic or isolationist or racist, and some aren't. And some are serious post-liberal thinkers like Deneen and Vermeulen and those guys, and some are what social scientists call morons. And so that's all stipulated. I put it to you, sir, that vast swaths of the new right are not, in fact, conservative. They're right wing. I can't really argue with that. But in their radicalism and in their antipathy for, among other things, those terrible democratic norms, but also just norms in general about character, about tradition, about culture, about civility, and all that kind of stuff, they are not conservative. And I think that this is an important point to emphasize, since we started out talking about William F. Buckley, because William F. Buckley was conservative in terms of a lot of those things I was just describing. And he recognized that there were a lot of elements on the right that were not conservative and should not be included inside the tent as conservatives if you're going to build this political movement that he was trying to build. So
right.
How do you do you think it's fair to say that a lot of the new right is not conservative? And B, do you think it matters?
Sure. Well, I liked your piece. I wrote a similar piece a couple years ago for Commentary magazine, based off a reading of a collection of new writings that was
I missed
published.
that. I'm sorry.
It's a few years ago. It's okay. I'll send you my complete CV after we finish this recording, so you can catch up, Jonah.
It'll take forever to print it out.
I'm going to leave the norms debate aside a little bit,
Okay.
and I'm just going to focus on policy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great post on social media the other day from someone. I guess they were posting some description from a mainstream media source saying, the MAGA faction, which is against support for Israel, against Operation Midnight Hammer, against Iran's nuclear facilities, against reforms to the Medicaid program, and for increasing taxes on the wealthy. And I wish I could give credit to the poster, but this person who I follow said, yeah, you know what that's called? 1980s liberalism, right? It's not conservatism.
Yeah.
It's just not. So I take it from the point of view is my conservative belief system lends me to certain positions on issues. Those positions tend to give the maximum degree of individual freedom for adults that's consistent with public order at home, and a foreign policy that pursues the interests of the United States to make this country secure, prosperous, and free. Okay? And that is anti-totalitarian, anti-communist. There are plenty of people now who are part of the Republican coalition who, as you well know, hate my guts, hate your guts, disagree with everything that I just said. And they want the Republican Party to turn into a vehicle for a kind of working class, big government populism that is also fortress America. That is an America that just says we're not going to engage with the world unless maybe, someone sends a fleet of ships to Key Largo. Then maybe we'll get involved. That to me runs against the American conservative traditions that I trace back even to the 1930s. The truth is that we keep referring to America first, but the foreign policy context is very different today. Right? American power is very different today. Also, history has happened, so we know the lessons of American isolationism in the interwar period. Right. So I think it depends on who you're talking about. If you're talking about this group that was calling for increasing taxes on the wealthy as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill that is anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-American intervention overseas to protect a key American interest that 4 American presidents of both parties have said that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And if you're talking about, and this gets to kind of the norms, but if you're getting to the point where you hear people saying that the Constitution is passé, we're living in a, the Constitution no longer matters. All we need is a strong man. Trump 28, regardless of whatever the Constitution says. Those are they're not conservatives. They're not. But they are part of this coalition. They are part of this Republican Party. And so it's making the Republican debate, to me, as I mentioned in a Free Press piece that's out today on June 24th, actually more interesting than what used to be the debate between the parties. Mm-hmm. We used to have a debate between the parties, but now, like, most of the Democratic Party or the non-woke part has migrated into the Republican Party. And so our intra-coalitional debates are actually more dynamic and interesting and polarizing and vicious than the inter-party debate. Now, how long that will last, I don't know, but I do think it's key. On drawing limits, just briefly, yeah, Buckley had a few rules. I mean, the key figure here, there are a couple, but one is George Wallace, mm-hmm. the Alabama governor, who was a New Deal, working Southern Democrat populist who had tremendous popularity in the North when he ran for president. Buckley made it a point to always say that Wallace could not be an American conservative because Wallace still had faith in the centralized bureaucratic state. And I think that's a line rather we have to draw. I agree with that. And the other key figure is Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society. And the debate between Buckley and the Birchers, very complicated. It went on for several years, but the principle involved was American conservatism should not have room for conspiracy theorists and anti-Semites. Once these elements get into a movement or get into a country, they destroy that movement in that country. And it's not just that Buckley felt conspiracism and anti-Semitism were wrong. He also knew that if they were allowed to imbue his movement, that he was trying to get off the launch pad, so to speak, the whole enterprise would fail. And so I think we have to draw similar lines today, whether it's about the role of the state, whether it's about kind of the mentality that doesn't just support Wallace because he hates intellectuals and he says there's no difference between the parties and he says that he's going to, crack down on law breaking, but also kind of likes Wallace's, flirtation with authoritarianism. I mean, mm-hmm. the personality. I mean, to hear these, there's a great description of a Wallace rally in Gary Wills's book Nixon Agonistes, and you see a lot sometimes in American politics as well. The kind of the main figure on stage getting the crowd excited, and the devotion to this personality rather than to any broader set of ideas or agenda platform planks. So that should not be part of the American conservative movement, and nor should anti-Semitism and conspiracism, all because it's wrong, but also because ultimately it's not going to succeed. It's going to marginalize conservatism once again in the United States at a time when I think, as a conservative, there is so much to be excited about. And the goal of Buckley, we always have to remember, was to take these ideas that he inherited from his father, that he marinated in growing up as a child, and take these ideas and bring them out of the wilderness where FDR had placed them. And he did. And he did. And in fact, the ideas are so widespread now that they've actually invited challenges from kind of from both inside the tent and then the people who were kind of the camp followers right out, following behind and now in on the party. And that's, I think, what we have to protect against as conservatives.
Yeah. So, do you have just a minute more?
Yeah, okay. Of course.
Okay. So
for you,
so I agree with a lot of that. I also think, though, that the problem is bigger because conservatism, broadly speaking, the Republican coalition, broadly speaking, was, I remember Fred Barnes used to talk about this, right? It was that the Democratic Party was a coalitional party and the Republican Party is an ideational, his word, party. And what he just meant by that is that the Republican Party says, if you agree with us on 7 out of 10 of these things, you should be in our party. And the Democratic Party was like, it was an explanation for, which I've used for years, about why the party of the Teamsters was also the party of gay marriage, right? Is because it was a we'll scratch your back, you scratch ours kind of organization. The Democratic Party has come a cropper because of that, found that structure. But the problem with the Republican Party in the era of Trump is that while a lot of people will make the argument that because Trump is going to deliver on 7 out of the 10 things that you believe on, you should be part of the party. And I understand that argument. But the thing that holds the actual coalition together now is really basically just support for one man. It's the cult of personality aspect. You can rationalize on ideological grounds commitment to the coalition, and you can certainly make arguments about the transactional this and transactional that, and I get it. And some of those arguments, I mean, it's going to be years before a contrary word about Donald Trump comes out of John Podhoretz's mouth because of what Trump has done with Iran, and I get it. But if the ultimate priority is if the defining test, particularly for jobs, is loyalty to a personality, then by definition, as a fact of logic, things like anti-Semitism or de facto socialism, whether you would call it nationalism or not, industrial policy, all these kinds of things, or rank incompetence, matter less. And so it's great that I support what Trump did in Iran. We'll see by the time this airs, maybe, we're all in a nuclear rubble. But for now, I support what he did. I think it was the right thing to do. I have caveats about, the war powers stuff and all that, but that's a different argument. But it's great to celebrate all that. It's also just sucks that, like, the White House, the Pentagon press secretary has this history of anti-Semitism. And that used to be a litmus test kind of thing where you just say, well, that person can't get a job because look what they've said. Or that guy, Paul Ingrassia, couldn't get a job because look what he said, And so the dynamics of the coalition building on the right now are really, really weird, where you can be in good standing by being a loyalist, but having absolutely heretical ideas. And that's why I take your point about how the intramural arguments are more exciting now. My problem is I find very, very, very few, there's some, respectable interlocutors in those debates. because at the end of the day, most of the arguments made the second the issue of Trump comes up become pretextual, and they start from the conclusion Trump is right and they reason backwards. And if you have a serious commitment to post liberalism or any of these other ideas, from time to time you should be very cross with what Donald Trump does, because he violates all ideological strictures. And I feel like it's very revealing that the one place where a lot of people have been willing to actually stand up to Trump among the sort of sycophantic loyalist crowd is the defense of Israel. I mean, that kind of tells you there's a revealed prior there that I think is very interesting, but we don't need to get into all that. My only point is that I think that this is a more depressing time, because what Buckley actually cared about was arguments, was actually fighting for the principles in clear terms, and I see very little of that on the right these days. The reason I've written a dozen columns about one of the strengths of the American conservative movement was that we were willing to debate things amongst ourselves, that we would have these sort of fusionist arguments among ourselves, and that made us stronger and more serious in the battle of ideas, which AI represents. And I find a lot of the sort of MAGA coalition truly and sincerely uninterested in ideas and uninterested in arguments. And I don't think that's good. It may be good for the political coalition for a little while. I think it is pretty bad for the conservative movement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I like ideas too.
This is the life we've chosen.
I think a lot of your disappointment may be tied to technology, which you often bring up on this program. There's just a difference in how argument is conducted in the new public square of social media than the way in which it was conducted when Buckley was had his height, when there was public debate, or in the pages of periodicals, or a newspaper column, all involving editors, all involving a certain amount of deliberation and delay. Now, of course, the papers, when they show up on my driveway each morning, are completely out of date by the time I bring them to my office a half hour later. So I think that is a reason we have less debate of these ideas, less fine tuning. We know the phrase brain rot. It was the phrase of the year. AI slop is a thing. And there's a lot of anti-Israel slop going out there as well. That is anti-Semitic. And that's, I think, part of the technology. Part of it is that Trump is not a member of the American conservative movement. He rarely identifies himself as a conservative. He called himself a nationalist in 2018. And now more recently, in the 2024 cycle and beyond, he calls himself common sense. He's common sense. So it's whatever he thinks is the prudential call at a given moment, which literally can change by the second or the minute. So that means that the debate within the Republican Party is just much larger than a debate that happened within the conservative movement, say 10 years ago, certainly 20, 30 years ago. And it involves people who we've just established are not conservatives. They're a form of national populism that is antithetical, actually, to conservative ideas and policy recommendations.
It's almost like someone should write a book called Revolt Against the Masses.
Yeah, right? Yeah. But at the same time, I quibble with a few things you said. I mean, the first is I actually don't know whether it's the coalitional nature of the Democratic Party that got them into trouble. I think it's the ideological nature. I think the parties have switched. I think the Democratic Party is much more an ideological party now.
Oh, I agree with that.
It's driven by these extremely niche ideological views on borders, on crime, on trans, on the economy, right? The modern monetary theory that kind of informed Biden's spending, which produced the inflation, which is the reason that the Democrats lost in 2024. I mean, that and the border, those are the two things, right? That's that ideological project is what got the Democrats into trouble, whereas the Republicans now are becoming this more coalition party where conservatives like you and me are just one part of that part. I'm not even saying you're a Republican. I'm just saying we're one element in this coalition, and there are all these other people. I mean, think about what we need a whole other hour to talk about Maha. I mean, that's amazing that this movement came up as a result of the pandemic, and then Trump, I have to say, in an act of political genius, says, I'm going to wed you to my coalition. Right? I think it helped him. I think it helped him in 2024. And now one of the
only times he saw the polls bump up, right?
And the most effective, for good or ill, cabinet secretary is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. There's no question about it, in my view. Right? So that's just today's Republican Party. And I do think that at some point we're just going to have to say, this is reality. And conservatives are going to have to fight for our ideas. We're going to have to put those arguments out there. And we're going to lose a lot. But we're going to win some too, and we need to appreciate the stakes, but also appreciate the wins when we get them. And that's kind of where I fall in to a lot of these debates.
Yeah. All right. So a couple points. One, I agree with you about the Democratic Party now. Part of my longer tale of woe about the Democratic Party is that they made the mistake of their coalitional politics led to them becoming an ideological party.
I agree. And I should say that the danger is that MAGA becomes too ideological.
Right.
This is the transition, and this is where I'm watching in the years ahead.
It's your point about Buckley keeping the anti-Semites out, is that that is infectious. You bring in a tumor, and it can affect the party. The Democratic Party brought in ideologues, and the difference to them.
Well, where you and I disagree is I think actually Trump is a force preventing the new right ideologues from obtaining from full power. There's no question there's a lot of them in this administration because of certain personal loyalties, because Trump is sticking with the people who stuck with him at the low point after January 6th and throughout all the lawfare. But when you just think about what Trump is doing, he's disappointing the new right.
Sure.
There will not be tax hikes in the One Big Beautiful Bill. The industrial, what is industrial? Trump wants to get rid of all the green tax credits from the infrastructure and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Trump bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, right? Trump supported Israel, its Operation Rising Lion, and still is letting Israel conduct its war against Hamas. And on immigration, we have this fascinating argument that is being overlooked as a result of all the talk in the media about the deportations, which is Trump kind of wants to increase skilled migration. And of course, MAGA doesn't. So the danger for me between 2024 and 2028 is that when Trump departs the scene, is he going to be replaced by someone who is more ideological than he is? Someone who doesn't understand the transactional, non-ideological kind of coalitional view that Trump has, really old school Democratic view, right? Mm-hmm. That could be a big problem because that ideological bent can be self-limiting very easily.
Yeah. So I think I quibble with you about this is that first of all, let me put it this way. I think that part of the problem, and I say this all the time on here, is that I think Buckley ascendant, right? Buckley on the rise, was at his best when he was adversarial with the Republican Party. When he was trying to make the Republican Party less of a Me Too party. Mm-hmm. And the point of the conservative movement was stage one was maybe make the Republican Party more conservative. Right. But the actual goal was to move the center of gravity of American politics rightward. It makes no sense to have a Republican Party that is extremely right wing or extremely conservative, and I mean that in a positive or a negative sense. It doesn't matter for the point if it doesn't bring the rest of the country with it, because the point is we're supposed to care about the country more than we're supposed to care about the party.
Right.
And I think part of the problem, and I think Fox News is a big part of this, but it's more widespread than that. Part of the problem is that for a lot of people, being a conservative intellectual is also de facto kind of being a Republican Party consultant. Like, here's what the Republicans need to do to win, and if we do this and we do that, and you get these plural pronouns very quickly of us and we, where like I know that you understand these distinctions, that the conservative movement and the Republican Party and the conservative coalition and the Republican coalition, these are different terms.
Mm-hmm.
The Venn diagrams overlap, and like it gets very easy to replace one term with the other term, but in fact we're talking about different things. But because of this tendency of conservative intellectuals to internalize their association so strongly with the Republican Party, you end up in this situation where you have conservative intellectuals defending Trump on political grounds, but the takeaway for a lot of people is, okay, so what Trump is actually doing is conservative. Mm-hmm. And what Trump is actually doing is not conservative. In fact, I have this piece that's sitting with a major publication, we'll see where it goes, making the case that Trump is the revenge of the Nixonites. Like he has brought Nixon back into the center, Nixon style politics back into the center of the Republican Party.
And you're saying that's a bad thing?
I am saying that's a bad thing.
I kid.
Well, but it would be a bad thing from Buckley's perspective, right?
Can I just say that I have no more favorite Instagram channel than the Nixon Library Instagram feed. It is the best social media feed I follow, because it is just video clips of Richard Nixon talking. And this is how big of a nerd I am. I could listen to those all day long.
So I thought it was in here. Maybe I brought it to the office. I have this poster. It used to be in my office at AEI, back in those halcyon days where I had an office, rather than my cubicle, my veal pen. It's this poster with Nixon sitting on the front steps of like the Capitol, I think.
Yeah.
Talking to a little blonde boy in a red blazer and shorts. And the blonde boy has hearing aids because you have to signal some kind of victim status, right?
Right.
And the big quote on top is, for the first time in 50 years, we're spending more on social welfare than we are on defense. This is what he was bragging about.
Yeah.
Right? And then each of these little bubbles around this picture are about how much more money he's spent on women and the ERA stuff and on blacks and civil rights stuff. And Nixon was the last Me Too Republican.
He was.
People forget that because he was good on anti-communism. But he was a progressive, EPA, affirmative action.
He was also pro-civil rights.
And he was pro-civil rights, which is
and
to his credit.
Conservatives argued against him on that, to their discredit.
No, to his credit, absolutely. And I think that the Nixon coalition that he wanted to put together was very much like it was the FDR coalition. He wanted to redefine the FDR coalition on Republican
majority,
grounds.
as Pat Buchanan called it.
And that's what and the best version, the best defense of the Trump project is that he's trying to do something similar, and which might be great for the Republican Party. It is not necessarily great for the conservative movement, and conflating the two things can get people into a lot of analytical.
We shouldn't conflate it,
problems.
but we should also understand. I know we're running up against time, and we both have things to do. But we should also understand that conservatives, had an extremely complicated relationship with Richard Nixon, beginning after the 1964 election, when Barry Goldwater went to the landslide defeat. And Buckley supported Nixon in '68. Of course, the Manhattan 12 came out and suspended their support of Nixon after he recognized Red China and imposed the new economic policy in '71. Then they found that they really had no alternative to him when George McGovern was the nominee in '72, and they ended up supporting him for re-election in that landslide in '72. Watergate happened. The conservative movement was split. The great Stan Evans once said that he didn't start supporting Nixon until Watergate.
Yeah.
But of course, our friend George Will made his bones, so to speak, lambasting Nixon and Agnew during Watergate. As I tell my students, and they're always interested to hear this, is that Buckley's brother, Jim, the senator from New York, called for Nixon's resignation in the spring of 1974. Buckley followed, calling for Nixon's resignation in the summer of 74. Barry Goldwater, of course, days before the actual resignation announcement on August 8th, Nixon resigns on August 9th, 1974. Goldwater tells him,
you don't have the votes.
You don't have the votes, and I might not be one of the votes.
Yeah.
But Barry Goldwater, my conservative hero, he was still there with Nixon up until the very end. And you know who never called for Nixon's resignation? Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
In fact, there's this great moment where Buckley sends Reagan a letter. He sent Reagan many letters at this time saying, you really should come out against Nixon and say he should resign. And the last reply from Reagan was, hell no. so I agree with you. When it's not conservative, we should say it. But my point of view is I'm looking for what I can achieve to shift the ground toward the conservative side of things. And the way that things have worked out is I believe we have a much better chance of that now than we would have had Kamala Harris won the 2024 presidential election. And I say that, by the way, as detached analysis, not as someone who was campaigning for any particular candidate. I was definitely campaigning against Kamala, but I wasn't campaigning. I wasn't in the ranks of the MAGA grassroots field team, so to speak.
All right. I mean, we can do this for a long time. We'll have more opportunities. Matt Continetti, always a pleasure. Vocal punctuation on the Commentary podcast. Columnist for the Free Press. Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and author of The Right, which has a subtitle, which I don't remember. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, Jonah.
Okay, so Matt Continetti has left the studio. Always great to have Matt on. I used to have a sheepish thing about the fact that he is more fluent in conservative arcana than I am, but now I'm completely comfortable with it. He's not the only one. There are dozens of people who are even bigger conservative intellectual history nerds than I am. And I think longtime listeners will catch some echoes, some themes, some leitmotifs in our conversation that could be expanded on in all sorts of interesting ways. Anyway, on this, just a couple points that we kind of had to race through. On the point I was trying to make about the coalitional nature of the Democratic Party, so Matt made this point that I think is right, that Buckley recognized that there are certain kinds of worldviews that if you admit them into your coalition, whether it's a political coalition like the Republican coalition, or if it's an intellectual coalition like the conservative movement, they're infectious, they're dangerous, they're noxious, they're toxic. And that's why you have to have a clear, bright line and keep them out. We talked primarily, almost exclusively, about the Birchers and anti-Semites, but there were others. I mean, there was a reason why Ayn Rand was so unceremoniously and a little unfairly defenestrated in the pages of National Review by Whittaker Chambers. And which is not to say that I don't think Rand. I think Rand made some important contributions and was very popular with a lot of Americans. Atlas Shrugged still is like one of the best-selling books of the last century. But she was not a conservative. And Buckley's argument for why she wasn't a conservative was because she didn't have respect. As the way Buckley would put it is, you don't have to be religious You don't have to be faithful to be a conservative in America, but you need to have, as he put it, at least as I heard him say it, respect for the transcendent and respect for transcendence and notions of transcendence. And she didn't. She was contemptuous of all religion and whatnot. And there were other things that made her, ill-fitting for the conservative movement. But my point is that Buckley recognized, and whether you agree with him about Rand or about the Birchers or about, whoever, that's fine. But he believed that there were certain views that where you just couldn't find enough common ground, or where there were certain commitments that were so heretical and so noxious that you just needed to keep them out of the movement or out of the coalition. I agree with that. I certainly agree as an analytical matter. That's what Buckley believed. I also believe as an analytical matter that Buckley was right. I also believe as a moral matter that there's some people that you shouldn't find common cause with or form a popular front with. And my point about the Democratic Party was that the Democratic Party, because of the nature of its coalitional organization, admitted people into positions of power and influence within the party who then set about to change the nature of the Democratic Party. And that's how they've gotten themselves into a problem. You can talk about it with the anti-Israel crowd and call it anti-Semitic. That's not the argument I'm trying to make here. I'm just trying to make the point that if you're going to have a coalitional party, then you cannot have a very effete, narrow philosophical, ideological faction in charge of what the reputation and branding of your party is going to be. And that's what happened to the Democratic Party. Where I kind of depart a little bit from Matt on this is that the point I was trying to make is that the Republican Party has admitted similar types within its coalition. You can make an argument on raw political grounds that that's fine and defensible. Politics is about addition, not subtraction. I get all that kind of stuff. That's fine. But here's where the distinction between the Republican coalition, the political coalition, and the intellectual coalition becomes important. Because so much of conservative writing these days and conservative thought gets boiled down to partisan arguments about Democrats versus Republicans or right versus left, there has been a tendency, just look at the Heritage Foundation. There has been a tendency to conflate the two things and say that it is because it is the obligation of conservatives to defend the Republican Party. You get this, it becomes necessary to defend what the Republican Party does as conservative. And that is just a mess and not true. You can make a strong argument that conservatives support the Republican Party, but you cannot make a strong argument that everything the Republican Party does is conservative. And I think that sort of analytical confusion is all over the place. And I think the problem that Buckley recognized and that Matt and I were talking about letting in radicals and others who are antithetical to your core commitments, either as a party or as a movement or as an intellectual, cause, is really, really, really dangerous. And I expect I'm going to spend the rest of my life arguing with people, being on panels and being invited to write essays about this, that, or the other thing, or having conversations, all that kind of stuff, right? I'm going to spend the rest of my life with people who have become credentialized because of the Trump era as, assistant secretary of this or deputy director of that, who are not conservative, but because they have these credentials, are going to be touted and elevated as conservative people. And that is going to, in turn, create a cascade thing where what it means to be conservative is just going to keep changing over time because of all of this. And that's life. This kind of thing happens. And normally it doesn't bother me very much, but you have people like Orrin Cass trying to redefine, seize and hold the term conservative economics as being about industrial policy, about protectionism. He is teaching a course or something for Hill staffers, for Republican Hill staffers, this week or last week. I saw something on social media about it. I don't think that stuff is conservative. I don't think it fits the definition of conservative as rightly understood. But this conflation of partisan interests with this new right stuff is creating a much bigger mess for the conservative movement than I think Matt sometimes would. I think he recognizes the dynamic, but I don't think he rates it as big a problem as I do. And I think a lot of my friends on the right don't, and Matt's one of my friends too. I mean, so anyway, that's where I'm coming from on this. You'll be hearing more about all of it in due course. And anyway, by the time this airs, we'll have done a panel at AEI with me and Ramesh, Yuval, and Matt. I'm assuming it'll be recorded, and if it is, we will put a link to it in the show notes here, or you can go to ai.org and just search for Buckley, and you'll find it there. And other than that, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.